In this episode, I have an amazing conversation with Yasmin Stuart. Yasmin and I have been collaborating in particular on one of my rehab boarding cases here, Tonto. And Yasmin is an equine physiotherapist and trauma-informed horse trainer who practices in the UK. She combines evidence-informed practice with philosophy and intuition to create positive changes in the horse industry by empowering horse guardians to make informed choices for their horse as a unique individual, collaborating as an even more unique partnership. Yasmin's approach combines behavioural assessment, manual therapy, and movement therapy to support postural restoration and overall horse well-being. And you'll be able to see in this episode how aligned we are in our thinking and our methods. So I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Here we go. Hi there, I'm Lily. Welcome to the Vital Horse podcast. I'm a veterinary surgeon passionate about what our animals' behaviour can alert us to. I focus on nurturing the innate nature of animals to address the deep roots of health, well-being and vitality. Our relationship with our horses is an inextricable part of this. I am guided by what they show me. Many people say, if only they could talk, but they can tell us so much and we can communicate back. This podcast is about you being able to help your horse fully by finding out what's going on, deciding how best to help, and then doing this ethically and effectively. In this way, we can investigate and treat behavioural signs and underlying health problems, pain, or dysfunction in our horses while actually improving our relationship with them. Let's find out how. Okay, so Yasmin, welcome to the Vital Horse podcast. I'm really glad that we managed to find a date to both come on here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor, and I'm really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, I think we might have to maybe temper our enthusiasm to stop it being about 5 hours long.
I just can't help myself. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so um, I guess the first thing, because our conversation is probably going to be in the movement medicine realm, if we're thinking about the four deep roots that I kind of structure my conversations around. Um, I guess it would be useful for listeners to have some background of like where you're coming from in terms of the influences on what our conversation will take us to, and what you offer as well to horse owners as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm an equine physiotherapist as a formal title. I would suggest that I probably work outside of the tradition of equine physiotherapy. Um, and I've taken that kind of viewpoint because I'm really looking at empowerment for horse owners, and by empowerment I really want to help them to discern what is appropriate for them and their horse, and within that I'd like to help them to discern that within the scope of a welfare based framework. And that draws from evidence based practice. And then that also kind of draws from a philosophical, introspective based practice as well. I, when I'm working with a lot of people, I find that there's quite a bit of frustration around how their experience of the industry as a whole. I think the expectations they have of horses in general, um, the fact that perhaps the horses are not meeting their expectations, but also aren't meeting industry expectations either. And then there's a lot of frustration around the professionals that they have available to them as well. And I would suggest that I'm not exempt from being a source of frustration either. So I'm not putting myself on a pedestal there of saying my way is the only way. But I certainly know, as a human who has worked in the industry and also um, worked with the industry, I would suggest that humans help themselves to suffer a great deal. And so, if we can philosophize and introspect our way around a subject area as well, I think that can help with everyone's individual suffering. But then, moreover, if we can add some evidence basis into that, whether that's evidence based practice or, you know, evidence based philosophy, if you like, we can also help the lives of horses to be a lot better. So within that, I have a practice. I work up and down the UK. I also travel to different countries for clinics. And then I also offer online resources through the medium of I have a weekly email which has a free bodywork training or palpation technique each week, again, just to support the lives of people and their horses and help people to learn about their horses, as well as a webinar approximately once a month, although this year I've slowed down on that just purely because of other projects. And then I've also got a couple of online courses as well, all in the interest of just helping people to see their horses. And then when you can see your horse, I think that's when you can build a plan for what your horse needs. And I think that's really exciting. That empowerment piece excites me so much, to be able to give people the tools to see and then also help them to build the creative landscape for them to help their own horse, I think is really cool. And I guess with that as well, I get so much joy from that dynamic, introspective curiosity about what each horse may or may not like as an individual. And I find it quite exciting when other people also have that joy, or, when other people recognize that their horse isn't just a horse, they're this whole sentient being with this whole lived experience that we get to influence, which is scary, but also really cool. And how can we influence that for the best? How can we enhance and enrich their lives? I think that's really fun.
Yeah, that's amazing. There's so many parallels. I was just making some notes there, and it was really funny because there are a few things that you said where the words came up in my head just before you said them. Like, oh my God, how much more joy do you get out of this process when you do it this way?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And it's really amazing as well, just discovering this community of people who I think it was on another podcast episode actually the other day that I was listening to. I can't remember which one it was, but somebody made the very good point that often, maybe more what you would perhaps say heart-centered horse people, I guess, or maybe horse-centered, looking at how the horse feels about things. That process when you first start can be somewhat isolating, and you can kind of hide yourself away maybe because some of the stuff that's going on in more of the arena that you've been used to uh, doesn't really sit well with you, and then it can feel isolating. And it's so amazing to find that there's actually so many people who want to do it this way instead. It's very reassuring.
It is. And I also I remember there have been several times throughout my career with horses where, and also just my lived experience with horses, where I've known in my heart, this isn't this isn't it. This doesn't feel good. There's something that doesn't sit right with me. And then I've gained a sliver of information which has made me think, that's the direction I want to go in. I don't know how to move in that direction. And it can feel like you're on this precipice, you're on the edge and you're looking into what feels like the abyss. There's nothing there. Where do you go with that tiny little slither of information that you picked up, maybe from an article that you read? Or for me, I pick up lots of bits actually from outside of the horse world with more introspective reading, whether that is sort of philosophy based or whether that is Buddhism based or whatever. And I think that can be quite daunting. And I think a lot of people can also find that really daunting, that it feels like, as I said, the abyss. But then once you've sort of immersed yourself into it and opened up your creative boundaries, I actually think it's a really rich landscape where you can draw from lots of different places.
Yeah, absolutely. And that bit about it being daunting, and actually, even there's another quote which I am paraphrasing because I can't remember it exactly, but it's about learning and actually sometimes even grieving being similar
Mm.
places, because there is a loss of what was before, and that can actually be quite hard sometimes. I've actually just finished teaching an online workshop on my attuned assessment approach, and we talked about that in noticing more things about your horse, even though everybody who signed up is obviously curious and wants to find out what's going on for their horse. And then at the same time, there can actually be a bit of a process of, well, feeling guilt maybe for not having seen things before, or not being able to now unsee what you can
Mm-hmm.
see, and realizing that you didn't see certain things before. I've actually just recorded, by the time this comes out, it will be out, but I've just recorded another podcast episode. And I got a bit teary because I was thinking about one of my previous horses who, now that I know better, I know how many things I didn't notice about him. And that can be really hard to face sometimes, but
Mm-hmm.
better. It's infinitely better.
Yeah. And I think with that, there is that grief element, which is realizing how much you didn't see. And then I certainly, when I reflect back on previous relationships with my previous horses, I also reflect on how there were many situations where I wasn't a nice person to be around. And, I wouldn't, in contrast to recent things in horsey news, I wouldn't have put myself on that scale. But I think it can be quite horrible to think there's this being that I absolutely love above all else. And then to reflect back and think, oh, I don't think they'd feel the same about me. And I don't mean that in the I need that love reciprocated. I mean that in the, oh, I don't make them feel as good about themselves as they make me feel. So I think there can be quite an ego death with that, particularly if you've got quite firm beliefs that are quite firmly held. If you've existed within a framework within the equestrian community, or for me, I'll use it as the example. A lot of my early career upbringing was around classical dressage. And I would suggest that the pendulum has thoroughly swung back the other way for me now. And that's not to throw any shade on anyone who's currently in that sphere. But, coming out of that community and sort of having to see that these ideologies that I absolutely lived by, I now don't necessarily believe, but also perhaps the harm that was enacted on our partnership by proxy of those beliefs, I think that can be really tough.
Mm. Yeah, something that I keep pondering. I'm not sure if I fully understand it, but the phrase keeps coming up in my mind quite often. Is and it's a Buddhist concept, really. Is this non-attachment? So a commitment as opposed to an attachment, and that can go
Mm.
various different levels, because having an attachment to a horse could actually lead to a less healthy relationship as opposed to having a commitment.
There's You've just seen my face there. Yeah. Oh, this is a really big subject that I also find fascinating. Um, and I also think this is that really difficult ethical discussion. The conversation that I have with a lot of my colleagues is always around how much is enough? How much do you need to worry about something versus how much can you let something slide? You know, the dose dictates the poison, if you will. Um, and I I think it can be quite easy when the veil has been lifted from your eyes and you see how much can be a problem for horses and for their well-being, particularly in the landscape that we have available to us right now, that I think it can be really easy to become quite hypervigilant about what it is we're seeing and also how meaningful it is for that horse. And an example that I find myself using quite a lot is hoof balance. You know, for some horses, some hoof balance might be more meaningfully detrimental to them than other horses with the same hoof balance that's equally suboptimal. And so I will circle back to what you said about, attachment versus commitment. I am getting there, but I will side quest on this one first. I'm always still looking at that horse deeply as an individual. What is meaningful to them? What might be a problem for them might not be a problem for another horse. And then also, do we really want to rest on our laurels and see whether that will become a problem for that horse if we don't do something about it? So, with regard to commitment versus attachment, I think that can be quite a tricky sort of game for someone to play. How much do you worry about? But if you don't worry about it, does it come and bite you on the bottom because you haven't worried about it? But then equally, if you worry about it so much, does it become the bane of your existence and make life positively unenjoyable for you? But I do believe that horses can feel the intention as well. I certainly know that from the body work that I offer. If I come in with a fix it mindset, there's no way anything in that body is shifting. But if I come at it with a, hey, what do you think about this kind of mindset? Things do start to shift. So that intention of I need to fix my horse, this is awful, I'm the worst person in the world, can be really challenging. So I'm not sure whether I've added any more to that thought or confirmed your thoughts. I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you've definitely opened it, opened it for a discussion. I think the thought that came up when you were talking about that for me is that when we start to be more observant, it can result in this hypervigilance or lots of worrying. And then you can actually get an analysis paralysis where you actually you either don't even know where to begin because there are so many things that could be a problem, or you see how much your horse communicates maybe some signals of like, please pause or please don't do that right now. And so you don't know how to start even interacting with the horse to help to change those kinds of things. So I guess the thing that I always come back to with this question is it is actually quite amazing what innate body wisdom beings have for helping themselves. But quite a lot of the time, some of the things that we do are actually just blocking that a bit. And particularly, I said at the beginning that we were going to talk a lot about movement medicine, but this comes back to husbandry for happiness, because I think that their lifestyle and the way that horses can make choices for themselves really affect how much these so-called maybe optimals that we might strive for actually matter to them or not. So if we're sticking with the hoof balance example, if you have a horse that doesn't experience many different terrains or has to cope with very many different terrains, you would have a different demand on improving their hoof structure, comfort, and function than you would with a horse that was experiencing a different type of living environment. Or if you're asking for a particular level of athletic performance. Whereas if they are at liberty to make a choice about, and not just at liberty as in not wearing any tack, but if they actually have the agency to make choices about things, I think that they usually either will help themselves or you can watch them. So this is one of the main sort of concepts in my attuned assessment approach, is that you can watch them and see what it is that they are trying to help themselves with and what might be blocking them from them being able to help themselves with that. And that could be something like, for example, you notice that they always pile bedding up under the back of their feet, for example. And then you have a pretty good idea that either the back of their foot is uncomfortable or they would prefer to be standing at this angle or whatever it is. If they have no ability to even express that type of behavior, one, you won't know about it. And two, well, they won't be able to help themselves with it at all. So there's multiple examples of that kind of thing being the case. If they've got soreness somewhere, for example, at a particular feeding height, but there only is that feeding height available, then we have to do something in order to address that soreness. It's a bit like the doctor joke of my arm hurts when I go like this, and the doctor saying, don't do it then. Because if the horse has got the option of, of moving in a different way, well, I mean, bodies have got so much intelligence in them that comes back to the ego death thing again, in that, you know, there are a huge range of horse professionals which have a huge range of extremely useful skills. And also, they might not always be needed to help the horse. The horse might be able to do their own, you know, exercises and get themselves out of a stuck place. So those are the thoughts that came up for me when you were saying that.
Absolutely. And another thought that kind of pinged up from there, having come from the place, as I mentioned earlier, of it being, for me, definitely about absolute control of movement. And if we can absolutely control the movement, we will, the horse will improve. The horse will get better. You just have to do the correct uh the correct number of exercises in the correct order, in the correct form, and things will improve. And the biggest learning, if you like, I think is, for me, certainly so far, um, is the balance being so much around the extremes and what's fair, reasonable, and possible. And whilst, if I'm looking at a ridden horse, my preference would be that they can access all of their range of motion, but oscillate primarily around neutral, or certainly not in an extended posture. Um, but I really want that horse to have access to all of its range of motion and have equal opportunity to explore all of it, because that is what body health is. I was having an interesting discussion with a colleague of mine. Both of us have been diving down the scent work watering hole, which I've found really fascinating from multiple levels of seeing how horses choose to use their body as an individual, seeing how their body changes through enacting some foraging behaviours. But then also, I was discussing with a colleague, because she knows of these horses who only have access to eating from hay nets at a certain position, and then they go out on grass, and she observed that they went out on grass and all of them became really sore because they hadn't had the opportunity to practice grazing for quite some time. I don't know how long. And then they came off of grass for a bit for whatever reason, but they were all doing a little bit of scent work. and then they went back out on grass and didn't have the same problem grazing. And we had this discussion of, was it the scent work, or was it the fact that they had the opportunity to explore different ranges of motion? So was it the cascade of kind of activating the olfactory system, or was it just simply that the horse had different opportunities to place their head on the floor and therefore they didn't become sore? But again, all of that simply just reinforced to me, if we can create some optionality in movement and then also look at the patterns around that, the preferences, how much of that preference is indicative of something that horse finds challenging, how much of that preference is indicative of where a horse is trying to support themselves, and how can we give them as many options as possible to find health within the fact that their body wants to do that too.
Yeah, actually this might be a good point to mention Tonto because we've both worked with him, and he is amazing at teaching you about not imposing your agenda on trying to improve something that is rethinking over and over again how can I help you, as opposed to how can I fix this.
Yes.
We were talking about this the last time you came here, that I've even watched him only on cameras because he sometimes gets a bit shy when you're watching him. And he even seems to know when I'm watching him on the camera and stops what he's doing. But he has explored so many different options of so in the free living environment here, and things like scent work and treat search stations and stuff like that. He what am I trying to say? So because he has a lot of he's very obedient and compliant, and that can cover up quite a lot of worry about are you asking something of me? And I think I think it's sort of a bit of a false separation to look at is this a problem with our communication or maybe training or something like that, or is this a physical problem? Because they swing so much into each other. It's so fluid between the two, and helping one always helps. You kind of have to ping pong between the two, unblocking things. That's what I think that he's really highlighted to me.
Are you able to elaborate on that even more, the relationship between communication versus have you got a problem? Because I find that really interesting.
Yeah. So I think first of all, the thing that you mentioned earlier about if you approach bodywork with a how can I fix this kind of intention, it's chances are you're going to be derailed from what you expected to be doing. And I think that so Tonto is a horse that is exquisitely sensitive to the intention that you bring to your interaction. And so much so that seems to even transmit when you're watching him through a CCTV camera. And the thing that happens is that you can watch his posture. So posture is organized by the nervous system, which is, the inputs to the nervous system come from the structural body, but they also come from your thoughts and your emotions. And so you can see these postures sort of cycling when he is feeling different vibes, as it were. You can see these postures change in response to his sort of reception of those intentions, and he becomes he's like ready to be compliant and obedient, but it's a much more stuck kind of physical structure than when the vibe is more just free and easy. It's okay, we're just seeing what happens here. And that's like a dance that you have to um well, I always think, coming back to your point earlier about letting things slide or not, how much do you worry about something? You know, it's a constant question with healthcare, because there's maybe gold standard or what's considered optimal or what's considered evidence-based. What do we need to do about this? But that's not always, do we need to do this right here, this second? But there's also, if we do need to do something, how do we have this conversation of actually right now we really do need to do this thing? And the rest of the time we can really have a conversation where it's more two-way. So I think that's that's the challenge with horses that become like that, is that it really can lead to pulling back entirely and not, I mean, you know, watching him on the CCTV, I'm not even in the sound school with him when I'm doing that. So
It's interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry, go on.
well, yeah, it's exploring ways of changing that interaction so that you don't get the concerned, contracted, shutting down part without completely pulling away from the interaction entirely.
Yeah, and I also think there is an even broader scope here, which looks at, and again, I think it's actually very deeply individual, and it depends on people's your own individual interpretation of morals and ethics and welfare-based practice. And I think that's really challenging, a really challenging line to toe. Particularly if we were looking at it from the consent-based sphere as well, and the relationship between consent-based and welfare-based. Particularly, again, I think that one is a dance as well. If we're looking at basic management practices, i.e., dentistry, hoof care, vaccinations, depending on what country you're in, and the proposed risks to you if your horses are or are not vaccinated. And I think the difficulty being in the moment, if a horse doesn't appreciate something, but the greater good is for, we're doing it for a greater good. A bit like, I do not like going to the dentist, but I know that the greater good is such that someone checks my teeth to make sure that they are okay. And I think that is really challenging and fits into so much of that. It depends, and I think that each person, certainly what I say to my clients is, you need to understand your own moral and ethical kind of compass, as it were, and then build your horsemanship practice around that. And I use horsemanship broadly there. And the same from a professional standpoint. And I also think from a professional standpoint, it can actually be really difficult, because for me, I can go and I can spend an entire session observing a horse and hypothesizing what each tiny little micro movement or micro expression may or may not mean. And I know some clients might find that fascinating. And then other clients are saying, I'm here, or you are here to do a thing to help us to continue to do more things. And so the interplay between clients can also, kind of guide you in a direction. I think the beauty, when we come back to Tonto, is just a shout out to his human, who is incredible and incredible at being led by, whatever that horse wishes to show her, which actually has solidified an enormous part of my journey as well. Just from her observations of Tonto before Tonto even went to you. And yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it is a dance. And I also think it's interesting how you can be working with a horse, and I don't know whether you get like the little intuition kind of download where there's the voice at the back of your head completely from left field which says you should do this, and you think, where did that come from? And the voice goes, no, really do it. And so you do it, and it goes beyond your wildest dreams or your wildest expectations. And then in another setting, you couldn't possibly recreate that either. And that makes it quite difficult from a professional standpoint to put together a prescriptive framework, even because it's not a shaping plan, it's not all of these steps to success. It's, you know, it's sort of intuition, following a breadcrumb trail, having an approximate blueprint, and then also being prepared to be led by that horse as an individual, and also their human as an individual too, and the unique partnership that they make together.
Absolutely. And yes, I think like you say about individual clients or horse owners, horses, humans, figuring out or sort of navigating in the way that they would like to show up for their horses. And then it's also very individual to those horses, because with Tonto, for example, he isn't a horse where actually going right to the edge of his current comfort zone always results in a bit of a breakthrough. And so there are some horses where they might be finding something a bit difficult, but you know that once they maybe feel the alternative to what they're currently, say, a habitual movement pattern or something, if you can just go to the edge and show them without overly pushing them too far, and then they realize it's helpful to them and they have a bit of a breakthrough. And there's a whole discussion about whether or not you you can predict that always as well, because sometimes you think that you're going towards the edge and it isn't really what the horse needs. But then there are some horses where you really cannot push at the edges in the same way. You have to work well within a comfort zone where you're exploring where they are still comfortable. Otherwise, you get this rapid shutdown and compliance and obedience maybe, but it's not a it's not a transformational space to be in at that stage. So yeah, it's very horse individual. And thank goodness for Tonto's human allowing both of us to make all of these discoveries as well.
It's so interesting. And yeah, thank goodness for Tonto's human. I know being someone who tries to be thought-provoking on social media and also tries not to shame people, I think that's something that's changed out my career on social media as a whole. But now I'm really looking at helping to stimulate thought in the way that thought gets stimulated in my own brain, because I find that interesting. And something, a statement that I find interesting is when people say, oh yeah, but my horse is fine, whatever, you know, in whatever sort of context. And I'm always thinking, but what does fine mean? And I don't mean that I'm not being facetious when I say that. I mean, what is that for you? What does fine mean? How do you know your horse is fine? And if we were to open up further from that, what happens when your horse hits a threshold? What does that look like? How do you know you're getting there? How does your horse respond to that? And then my experience has often been that people often don't know that their horse is so close to threshold pretty much all of the time. that they actually only have a very finite window of communication, or they only have a very finite number of behavioural indicators that they will observe before their horse meets that place. And so certainly a lot of the work that I've been trying to encourage is more of a fact-finding mission of finding out your horse's preferences and helping people to see that preference extends beyond obedience. So obedience doesn't equal consent, nor does it equal enjoyment, nor does it equal preference for something. And I think that can be a really interesting question to pose for a lot of people because of the creativity needed for that as well, and also the fear and concern that can be evoked in the human in that moment. So I was going through, it was like a little enrichment playground that we'd set up with a client. We'd foraged for things and then hung them in the arena, and it was really interesting putting the human in the position of just following and just following the horse. So they were attached to the head collar, but just following. And you could see the way their nervous system was so primed to try to get the horse to go in a direction, to get the horse to see the thing, you know. And I don't mean that in a way to shame them. I thought it was kind of adorable because it was led with a little bit of excitement. Oh, let's go see what's over there. You might love that. But at the same time, I thought it was so interesting how even in the position of giving horses preference, we're still gently going, oh yeah, but come over here next because you might find that fun. And it's not really preference, you know.
Yeah, you just reminded me of a brilliant comment that somebody made who was on one of my attuned assessment workshops. And that's where her horse had a tendency to get, her words were frustrated and a bit angry during some training sessions sometimes. And she set up a sort of a treat search situation in the arena, and unusually for sessions had him at liberty. And there was a food puzzle that he found quite difficult, and he started to get a bit frustrated with the food puzzle. And then he left the stations, went over to the edge of the arena and started ripping quite distractedly and frustratedly at some grass that was growing through the fence. Visibly became smoother and softer in those motions, and then kind of looked around, blinked, and then walked with a much softer, lower head carriage back to the food puzzle and solved it immediately and carried on without showing as many signs of frustration. And she said one of the things that happens when he's starting to get frustrated during a training session is he will pull away from me towards the arena fence. And what she discovered through doing that is that what he was doing with pulling away was he was going to go and self-soothe by grabbing at some grass and reset himself a bit and then be able to retry the task. So he wasn't actually refusing to participate. He was actually most likely, you know, going to continue to participate, but he just needed to do something. He needed a moment first. And this is the value of, you know, there's so much of that individual and what I was meaning earlier about kind of their innate wisdom and their body intelligence, in that they have urges to do things that are likely going to make something more possible for them to do, or maybe more enjoyable. And so if we can notice those things, that's where things flow better, and also it's just amazing. So you do get a lot more enjoyment out of it yourself.
Absolutely. And I also think that's interesting coming at it from the human side of things again. I think that what you've just shared is really interesting in that that's a setting where you're really letting yourself be at mercy to what the horse chooses to do, which I think a lot of people can find quite scary and quite disarming, in that it might be that that horse chose to go away, grab at some grass, let that hormonal cascade dissipate, let the frustration out the door, and then come back and be successful at the task. And then there might be another horse in the room that says, this is too difficult, and I have a history of not being successful at difficult things, and therefore I'm going to completely disengage with this and not choose to participate. If we're looking at the enrichment playground as an example, I've also had it where you bring the horse in to wherever you're hosting the playground, you unclip them so they're at liberty, and they sort of just stand there because they're not used to the idea that they can make the decisions. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because you're looking at encouraging them to explore, but at the same time with that horse, not letting them build up a routine of, when we go here, I have this very select set of exercises that I'm allowed to explore. So you've got to keep the creativity coming into the room, so that each time that horse comes in, there's something different for them to be able to interact with. Again, so they're not building a routine, and then when you change that routine, they're kind of like, well, this is outside of the rules of engagement for me, and therefore I don't know what to do. And then at the same time, if you have a horse that's kind of neophobic and scared of new things, it's also looking at how can we create more change and more flow and more freedom in this horse's environment without triggering them and their fear. How can we open up the curiosity mindset without triggering the fear mindset as well? It's really interesting.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And it's interesting. So I definitely agree with not triggering the fear mindset. I was just thinking about my needle shyness teaching, and how with that, so there's kind of two prongs to my approach with that. The first one is to look at the individual horse's likely deep-rooted causes for their needle shyness. So are they perhaps finding the needle itself really painful? That might indicate an underlying body issue that means that they have more pain than usual. Is it a kind of a trauma thing where they might even be having sort of flashbacks to a particularly bad experience in the past? Is it perhaps the restraint that they're finding most difficult? So that's the example of the first prong of the deep-rooted causes. But the second one is a cooperative care training approach, which I usually use positive reinforcement to shape a cooperative care behaviour, and it's a predictable sequence of events leading up to the use of a needle. So it's not sneaking up on them with it, they know what's coming. And some horses, when you do that process, the chunking down needs to be so tiny, and sometimes when you reach the needle stage, they opt out of the entire process because they realize that is what's coming. But more often than that, so that's often probably when we haven't fully addressed the deep-rooted causes, I think. More often than that, I think it's the cycling through, because it's not so much that certain states we need to avoid at all costs. I think it's more that having some agility between states. We practice some agility between states, because I don't know that it's realistic that horses are never in a fear state around something that's human made happening. I think that that's always going to be the case, and we probably serve them better by preparing them. I think this cooperative care approach, the real value in it is that we cycle through very small chunks of, maybe, like I was saying earlier about pushing towards an edge, but we're staying far below a threshold where they can't really think through anything anymore, or they feel completely unsafe in their body. But all of this practice of cycling through is helpful when you come to maybe a situation where there's a bit more pressure to do something. So talking about needed procedures for welfare, so this dance between consent based and welfare based, because they don't always line up. It may be that you've prepared in a way where you're always honouring the horse's no thank you or please pause or no further today. You've cycled through that many times, but there comes a time where you can't actually fully honour that and you have to carry on because, say, for example, they need a wound stitching up or something, and you do actually have to use a needle and sedate them. I think it's still helpful that you've had that background. And so there's like the ideal or the norm, I guess, or the trying to think of a better word. It's like the overarching, more of the time we're experiencing this agency and feelings of being heard and feelings of safety, and then that bolsters you in times where it can't happen to that full extent.
Yeah, that I guess that would fit into allostatic load, wouldn't it? If that horse is spending that period of time with that reduced or that allostatic load that is as small as possible, then you've got more, I guess you've got more of a buffer, if you like. It's the bank balance analogy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I definitely I definitely agree with that. And I think it is, again, you're weighing up time spent positively versus the occasional negative experience. Even if you look at it like in your own friendship group, if every time you spent time with someone who was purportedly a friend, you actually came away feeling pretty terrible, you might choose to not have them as your friend and you might choose to not engage with them. But by and large, if you're spending time with people in your friendship group and that is enriching and uplifting and stimulating and all of the nice things, and occasionally you might have a difference of opinion which maybe doesn't feel so good, or maybe they're having a bad day and so your experience with them doesn't feel so good, you're less likely to eject ship out of the friendship because by and large everyone's getting nice things out of the relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things that I talk about as well with needle shyness is a kind of a relationship repair afterwards. If the way that it went probably didn't feel good to the horse, or actually it didn't feel good to you, how is it that, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that actually, how is it that we can engage in a relationship repair? Because I think it's actually quite complex, that it's like, yes, there's what's the overarching feeling in the relationship, and then also because some horses might have had such bad experiences in the past that they actually become quite worried about any human interaction after something that even just approximates it a small amount happening again. And I guess that's also a question of their capacity beforehand, actually, whether or not they've built that up. Yeah, that's a whole a whole area for discussion in itself.
That's interesting. That's something that I've been thinking about recently, actually, with my young horse and the current, I would say, project, but it's not really a project because I wouldn't say that I work on things that definitely, because I have so many interests out, just within spending time with her. But I would really love to continue to develop her confidence walking out in hand. And that is motivated by a few things. I love walking in the countryside. I love nature. I love all of that. And I love walking the dog, and to be able to take my dog for a walk and my horse for a walk at the same time and just be able to do that just seems like heaven. But also within that, what's in it for her. I love the foraging opportunities for her. I love being able to find out more about her preferences. What things does she like to forage? What things does she like interesting? How does she respond to difficult situations? How can we help her problem solving capabilities within that as well? Because, you know, when you're going out in the countryside, life happens and that sort of thing. Anyway, digress. Coming back to the point, in doing that, everything is looking at extending the boundary away from home, away from the herd. What does that look like? How do we build systems around this so I can explore when to extend, and then also understand when not to extend, and then also know that part of the human condition is also making mistakes, and also sometimes you extend the boundary and it will go swimmingly well until there's this variable that you didn't account for that came in. And so in extending her boundary, I'm looking, the example I would use for her is our routine we've built is we go outside the gate and there's a nice patch of grass there and she grazes there and I observe how she's eating. Firstly, in the moment, how does she start eating? Is she anxiously snatching or is she kind of cool, calm, and collected? Does she, over a period of time, does that eating pattern reduce into a more relaxed thing? Did it start relaxed? And if so, great. Does it reduce into a more relaxed pattern or does it continue to be upregulated? And then I choose from there, do we walk further to the next patch of grass? Or do we say today's not the day and we don't? And anyway, I've extended so I've got sort of 5 patches of grass down the mile-long driveway. And the other day we got to a patch of grass and then there was the killer log that she definitely has never noticed before. And she sort of woofed up into threshold and I just stood and I thought, okay, well, what do we do here? Do we immediately turn around and go home? Do we just see whether the threshold can come back down? And it sort of came back down and then she went, no, really, this is quite bothersome. And then, you know, no, really, I do need to go home. And we walked back to the patch of grass previously and down regulated and it was all fine. And then when I road tested that a few days later and I took her out the front, it was really interesting to me. It could have been purely circumstantial, but she came out the gate and was immediately, oh, goodness, I'm, you know, feeling worried. Was it because of that event? Maybe. Was it the fact that she's 3 and doing a grow? Maybe. It could have been this whole host of things, but building this kind of series of systems from a human perspective to help us to modulate what to do. And also know that when it does go wrong, there does need to be that repair process. But maybe that repair process for me feels like it could be built into the systems that you already have to road check before you extend the boundary. Does that
Yes,
make sense?
definitely, because it shouldn't be a daunting thing which makes you not do anything. I think, you know, the
Yes.
that you might have a slight I don't even want to really use the word rupture in your relationship, but you know, because that might sound a bit extreme. But if you know, I think the phrase taking messy, imperfect action is sometimes really helpful because it doesn't all have to be optimal, polished, you know, feel bad if you didn't prepare to the nth degree sessions with your horses, because that's what leads to paralysis, I think.
Yeah. And I also, so much of certainly how I feel is about breaking the societal norms maybe that we found ourselves in about always having a plan, always doing something, you know, building something so that we can extend. We're always looking at how can we improve more? How can we improve more? And what did we do wrong? How did we cause that reaction? How can we stop that reaction from ever happening ever again? And I think that's impractical, but I also think that's not, it's almost inhuman. I think so much of the beauty of the experience is the beauty that came out of the mess up. So, for example, with my horse, she saw the scary log hit threshold twice, but I found that in turning home, behaviour did not escalate, and so that was a really beautiful discovery to me of wow, what an amazing horse. Because my experience of troubled horses, and by proxy of what I do, I work with a lot of troubled horses, is you know if you do hit that threshold, it can be not a terribly pleasant situation for everyone involved just to survive kind of getting back to the stable yard. And then out of that, I think there is also value in that rupture, if you like, because whilst it wasn't pleasant for anyone involved, she also got to learn that perhaps the human is a safe person to be around because we got out of that situation safely. There was no further harm instigated by the human trying to control every single measure outside of that as well. And I think certainly for a lot of the people that I meet, with all of the shame and guilt they feel, being able to cut themselves some slack and mess things up and it not be the end of the world is also a good thing to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a kind of an unconscious maybe judgment of that process where um, a lot of the time it would be considered, or maybe we cut it short, or we didn't do what we intended to do by turning for home. But that's okay. You could attach a different judgment to that. You could attach or you could attach no judgment to it at all. It just was a thing that happened, and another time it might happen differently. You could attach, all sorts of judgments or not to that situation. And I think what you talked about at the beginning, actually, about expectations and frustrations, is that usually it's the expectation that actually sometimes we don't even realize that we're setting. We don't even realize that we have an expectation for something to go a certain way, and then we feel frustrated with an outcome that we didn't even identify as needing in the first place. And so maybe examining, are those expectations actually going to really serve us, the horse, and the relationship, or are they? Can we maybe just let them go? And I think this might actually be a good place to talk about um, expectations. So you talked earlier about like personal and then industry and then expectations maybe of professionals, or maybe frustration with professionals. And there were a couple of things that I thought of when you said that earlier. And the first thing is that a lot of the things that we do kind of have an expectation of our horse time are actually a really tall order. Like getting on their back and having a 100% harmonious and safe experience. It's like almost laughable. And yet, of course, we want to stay safe.
It's quite abstract as well, isn't it? Like, I still think hats off to the person who decided to sit on a horse, because what where did that one come from? I'm impressed. And also, again, like, but why? Why did you do that?
Yeah, I guess perhaps necessity in that case of yeah. Um, but there's an interesting conversation as well, because perhaps perhaps there's a different intention when something is more kind of workmanlike and your colleagues, as opposed to perhaps the horse is fulfilling a different kind of function for the human and maybe their ego.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I definitely derailed the conversation there a little bit. Was there another direction you were going
Well,
there as well?
yeah, so I was thinking of, I'm aware that we could probably talk for hours, but I wanted to touch on the expectations for function kind of question. because I think that this might be practically useful to people who are maybe asking questions like, am I missing some pain as a cause for behaviours in a ridden horse, for example, or should I be riding my horse right now? Those kinds of questions, um, because I think it might be helpful for people to hear that that it is, first rule is that it is actually a tall order for that to go swimmingly at all times, and then maybe just to go into a little bit of like physical, mental, emotional aspects to that, because we've talked about things like consent. We haven't so much talked about motivation, but there's so many things in that soup of whether it's going to be a what sort of an experience it's going to be for both participants, and therefore um, what behaviours will come out, and how the human is going to feel about it and how the horse is going to feel about it. So I thought that might be a good discussion for us to have.
Absolutely. I think I do agree sitting on a horse's back is a tall order. And then what I also think is really interesting once we are sat on a horse's back is that tradition would dictate that we then proceed to micromanage all of the ways in which the horse travels across the ground. And I see oftentimes, more often than not, I see very little credence. If we were to just for a minute take the horse's emotional experience out of it, I'm just going to park that to the side. But I see very little credence being given to the horse's anatomy. And I see that in several ways. A basic lack of understanding of how horses' bodies move, how the anatomy moves, the limits in anatomical range of motion, um, the influence or lack thereof that the human has on creating that, specifically when we're looking at shortening reins and, plus or minus pressure from other human body parts. And then also, I see very little understanding of that horse's development in any given moment in time. So, and I was guilty of this at the beginning of my career, especially seeing a weak horse and thinking I could prescribe the exercises. And again, if the horse did all of the exercises in the world, if, no one can see I'm eye rolling at myself right now. But I think it's interesting how you can see the weakness, and yet there can also be a little bit of cognitive dissonance that putting a horse in a difficult posture isn't necessarily going to stimulate the physical response that you're wanting it to stimulate, and you're not necessarily going to develop the things you're wanting to target because that horse is too compromised to be able to successfully fulfill the criterion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's something that I see quite regularly, and I don't mean that from a judgmental perspective. It's an observation. And then I think that there can be so much ideology wrapped up in how that horse should look that there can also be quite a lot of human fear. And I think that fear is arisen from what other people might think of me and my capability and my skill set as a horse person if I am not seen to be doing the thing that the industry tells me is the standardized norm. And I would say that that goes hand in hand with people's that no, that goes hand in hand with the difficulties that I find in my practice, saying to people, I'm not really sure that your horse is okay to be being ridden, or rather, I'm not really sure. I don't think your horse is okay to be being ridden. And I also don't think that it's okay that they are being ridden in that way either. But I think that's quite a difficult thing for a lot of people to stomach, particularly when there is quite a lot psychosocially around that as well, outside of the horse industry. So oftentimes I will, in workshops that I do with people, I also encourage them to recognize the feelings that come up in their own body as a result of that as well. And this is also something that I use, when a horse has sustained an injury or has, gotten a diagnosis, as we can then also proliferate quite a lot of fear around what that horse does day to day. Classic example being that horse maybe was on box rest for whatever reason, and then they go out in the field and gallop around, and one person might go, "Hey, hey, freedom," and the other person might go, "Oh no, injury." And I always encourage people to look at, okay, but what is premeditating that? Where does that feeling come from? Not that I'm a therapist, but also if you can understand, oh, this feeling comes from that fear of getting things wrong because of XYZ, maybe that can help you to also rationalize that feeling as it comes up and just start to pluck away at that little bit of control that you want to keep over that area. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I definitely agree with your assessment of the difficulty in, say, you're identifying a weakness, and then that doesn't necessarily lead to a successful outcome of a prescribed plan and a known outcome. It can, but it doesn't always. And I think actually probably something that is uh, under recognized is, so we've had a really good improvement in the recognition that certain undesirable behaviours in ridden horses can be indicators of pain or discomfort. I think maybe there's still not, there's that's still lacking in a lot of cases. But there's very little understanding of just not being able to just function, like you're saying about anatomical kind of possibilities for a horse to even do. I think that isn't very well understood, and I know it isn't. I mean, there was absolutely nothing on that when I was in vet school. There was absolutely no appreciation of, is this task that we are asking of a horse, is it even possible for them to perform? And they are actually amazing athletes, and they often somehow manage it. And then you think, how on earth have you been doing this? And it unfortunately will often eventually lead to some kind of a breakdown. But I think that that's really helpful to think in terms of function as well as in terms of, you know, just a specific diagnosis. Because if you have done a workup and you found something that you can kind of put a label on a horse, this horse has hock arthritis, for example, I don't know that we should necessarily stop there, because what is the function or dysfunction that has led to that developing, and what is the function or dysfunction now, and what are the horse's capabilities and limitations now and going forwards. And it's a constant checking. It's not like, oh, we've found that now and we have the answer. You have to keep cycling back with it. It's not something where I was talking on another podcast recently with Dr. Raquel Butler, and we were talking about how ridiculous it is, this phrase of he's been given the all clear. Because you're like, for what?
Like, what do you mean? What does fine mean? He's fine now. Yeah, but how?
Yeah.
How do we quantify that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I hope that's kind of practically helpful for people who might be in that process of asking those questions. What is my horse telling me about how able and comfortable and willing they are with something that I would like to do with them? Because it's not that I'm saying that people are blowing past that and don't want to acknowledge what their horse is communicating. It's like, decoding it. And often, I think also this is a good place to cycle back. I wrote down earlier what you said um, about like having an evidence-based practice, but also strongly using your intuition. And I think sometimes people can be somewhat maybe derailed from a process because they have their intuition on something, but it's maybe a bit vague. And if they seek help often from a professional, so this is coming back to maybe frustrations with seeking help from professionals, and the professional might say there's no evidence that this is a problem. And I think an important message that I would like people to be reassured by is that if you think that something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right. If you still think that your horse is not functioning or is uncomfortable or is in pain, you probably just haven't found it yet. It's not that it isn't there. And yeah, so I think that's
Yeah.
and I think
Just
also, sorry, with the frustration with professionals that and nobody is immune to this, that if that seems to be a common denominator, then the profession needs to look at what
yeah.
it's doing, its
Yeah.
processes and how it operates. So yeah, I just really hope that I think it is changing.
It is. It is definitely changing, and I think it's interesting. I'm going to pull on a couple of threads of what you just said there. But just to close this loop, it is interesting seeing up and down the country. As I travel up and down the country, I fall into a pocket where I think, oh, we're quite progressive here. I quite like this. And then I fall into another pocket and I think, okay, this is like circa 10 years ago. But the good news is I've already navigated that. So I can, in theory, help people navigate this because this is a territory that I have already traveled. So that's great as well. The other advice that I would give on a practical level is if people are stumbling across something specific, you have so much power to regress the ask. And that can be in training, that can be in handling, that can be in anything. There is it personally, and maybe it's maybe that's the who I am as a person, but I don't find it too difficult to work backwards from a series of problems. So, for example, if I have a problem with a horse at a canter in a ridden setting, then what happens at the trot? How problemy is the problem? Where are the indicators that the horse is okay in the gate below the gate that you have the problem in? If you have a problem when you pick up the contact, where does that problem arise from? Specifically, where does that happen? Does that happen when you start to shorten your reins, when you indicate that the reins are getting short, or does that happen within a specific range? In which case, do you have a problem that is a veterinary problem that needs solving, or to bring the anatomy back into it, is this actually an indicator that you are trying to do something that your horse anatomically can't physically achieve? So an example would be, I remember I've got a friend who's an animal behaviour consultant and she does bridle and bit fitting as well. And we would do behavior, bit fitting, biomechanics sessions, and they were always really interesting. And on one occasion we got called out to a horse who, this darling little pony, he was a show pony, he was just divine. and he couldn't move without his mouth being open and his tongue lolling out the side of his mouth. And the humans in question were having a horrible time with that because they wanted to go to this prestigious show and they couldn't possibly have their horse's tongue lolling out the side of their mouth. And they, needed a different bit for that to stop happening. And the when we arrived, and I watched, or we watched them ride the pony, and the problem went away when they lengthened their rein 6 inches because the horse anatomically, physically couldn't move in the position that they were asking the pony to move in. And I always think that is so much of a consideration, the anatomical piece. And then within that, if your horse anatomically can move within a range, is it the fact that they do not have the physical strength and conditioning to move within that range as well? And so I think that being able to have the problem solving attributes in there is also really helpful. So inviting people to think outside of the box too. And then when you do engage with a professional, you also have so much more information to give them, because you can say, for example, with Tonto's human, every time I saw her, it would be, I noticed this in this context, I noticed this in that context, I noticed this in the other. Sometimes it could be a bit bewildering because you think, well, we've got lots of variables and lots of moving parts, and I don't know how to piece them into a whole. But it also helps to build a picture, and I think that is really, really important. And then I also think there's a lot to be said for humans advocating for their horses. And what I mean by this is, if you engage with a professional and you do not agree with what they say, i.e., they come out to look at your horse and they say that your horse is fine, and you so vehemently believe that they are not fine, say something. And that is to get your horse, you and your horse, the help that you need. But I also, in any given setting, when I'm working with people and their horses, I like to learn because that helps to improve my scope of practice. And you never know what someone is going to learn out of what you communicate to them. I also think, and I often think this in the veterinary sphere, if you have a specific concern, if it's also your money that you're playing with, saying, I'm really worried about this area, please can we look at it because I'm prepared to pay for it, I don't think that does anyone any harm. Even if it's, no, really, that area is not a problem and we have the imagery and the diagnostics to prove it, I still think that's something really helpful.
Yeah, what I would say about that is the information gathering part is so helpful in that sphere, in that we don't conduct a scattergun diagnostics approach that puts the horse through lots of procedures that they might find stressful, certainly if they're invasive ones, without actually knowing that that's a problem body region or problem body system. So the information gathering part of it, so that it's less vague and as specific as you can possibly be, bearing in mind that the professionals should help you with that. It's not solely your responsibility as the horse guardian to do that bit, because you may need some guidance in how you collect that information or in the questions that the professionals ask you. But yeah, the information gathering stage, so that we can think, well, is this likely localized, for example, to the pelvic region, or is it actually their feet? And then we can, we may have to end up checking everything. Sometimes that does happen. But as long as that is in a kind of a bit of a logical process, because otherwise it's difficult to know what to do with the information that you get, because a diagnostic test result doesn't come back with a little arm raise, yes, I am the problem, because you might find stuff or you might not, and then it's being able to attribute a clinical significance to that we still need to come back to just the very basic parts of our information gathering, of what were the signs that the horse was showing and what does our physical exam show. And with that, I would say that something that I'm coming across quite frequently is I often ask people, like, was such and such checked? And they'll often say, well, I'm not sure. And then I'll describe what it would look like to check that. And they'll say, well, I didn't see the professional do that. And again, this is not to, I'm not trying to badmouth my colleagues. It's more a process of like, have we done more than a cursory look in order to say things are fine? Or have we really delved into this, and do we need to do more of a process?
Yes. Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. And I think it's also, what am I trying to say here? I then also think it's acknowledgement of the validity of every body system within the body as well. I think it can be quite easy as a professional to have vogues. I certainly know that I find it quite easy to have vogues, particularly when you can pick up chains or patterns of how things occur in the body. And then it can be quite easy to whiz through those vogues and think, oh no, there isn't something going on here, when perhaps there is. It's just not kind of highlighted itself to you in the same degree of intensity that it might in another horse that's also presenting with postures and behaviours outside of the horse you're presented with, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important point as well, because professionals are also human beings as opposed to like computers or something like that. So we're subject to the our own learning history and experiences, and how the rest of the day and the rest of the week has gone. And you can also get I know that, there's kind of like a bit of a joke in vet practice that things always come in threes. So you'll get three of something in a week that you haven't seen for a while. And of course, sometimes that's related to the weather or whatever it is. But you can get this, because we are humans, you can get some maybe confirmation bias, or you can have diagnosed something recently. And so that actually comes to the top of your list when you're looking at a new patient. And it's quite a practice to, and it's completely impossible actually to do it 100% of the time, to kind of approach every patient wiping the slate completely clean with fresh eyes. And so sometimes that's why it's useful, and this is kind of an expectation for ourselves as a profession or as professionals, is that perhaps we do need to have more than one look, because we will come with a different internal environment and learning history that day, that week, whatever it was, that we will be able to bring a different perspective to our thinking on the case. And so revisiting it for that reason is also helpful. Even with the same professional, even if you're not getting a second opinion, but also second opinions, of course, can also be very helpful.
Absolutely. And for that reason, from a professional standpoint, I make a habit of not revisiting my notes before I go to see a client as well. And sometimes that leads to me saying things like, was this splint here last time? And it's written in my notes, but I still want to ask because I haven't checked my notes, because I'm trying to look with that fresh face to make sure, or to basically to adjust expectations for things that I may have missed or not. And I also, I still think the information gathering piece, I also think, is really interesting, in being able to, when you really observe, and that extends outside of just the ridden setting, but being able to observe your horse in the environment, and give them novel places to move around in where possible, where it's safe to do so inside the scope of what you have available to you at your yard. I also think really serves as an interesting, not diagnostic, but it's definitely an interesting information acquisition as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we could probably go on for hours, but we should actually probably just do another conversation at some point.
I would love that. Yeah, thank you. This has
Yeah,
been
thank
really
you.
stimulating.
Yeah, it really has. And where can people find out about you? That's an important thing for the end of this podcast episode.
Absolutely. I operate, well, via my website. Sign up to my mailing list if you have the inclination to do so. So my website is yasminstuart@equinephysio.com. And my mailing list, it pops up as a pop-up, but if you scroll up to the or scroll down to the bottom of the page, it's called Modern Centaurians. So the idea being that we're really looking at curating curating partnership between the horse and the human, but in more than just what science dictates and what industry dictates it should be. I really want it to empower people to use a combination of evidence-informed practice, intuition, and also their horse and understanding their horse to become the best expert for them, to really enhance that partnership. So that comes out each week, and there's usually little things about what I've been looking at, links to podcasts, links to books I read, thoughts. There's always a journal prompt in there, which is again more to just stimulate the introspective mind. And also a tutorial, which the tutorial is normally always on bodywork or some sort of training or enrichment activity. Again, left quite open-ended because I really want people to learn their own creativity within it, but just to give them threads to pull. I also circulate around social media. I post on there, although I would say I don't spend much time there anymore. And on Facebook, that's Yasmin Stuart Equine Physio, and on Instagram, that's Yasmin Stuart Equine Physio. And then I do in-person or online consults as well, just where I try to empower people into helping them help their horse and become their horse's best expert too.
Brilliant. That's great. Yeah, and we'll definitely speak again.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you so much. I feel like it's I get to have really cool conversations with people in the industry, and then very occasionally I think this is a person who's having similar thoughts to me, and that's really fun to be able to explore around a thought. Looking at tradition and then the scope beyond tradition into evidence-informed practice and then into more philosophical based practice too, which I think is really fun.
Yeah, it's an amazing space to be in to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you, Lily.
Yeah, thank you. See you soon.
Soon.
Thanks for listening to the Vital Horse podcast, where you can find discussions focused on helping horses in ways that combine scientific principles and evidence with compassion and understanding. Do subscribe if this content has rung true for you. To work with me in a way that honours both head and heart, check out my online and in-person offerings at www.nurturingnatureequine.co.uk. If you are facing problems or are trying to answer questions with your horse, remember that physical, mental and emotional well-being are inextricably interconnected, that there is a wisdom to nature and to the body that we can assist, and that cultivating meaningful relationships with our animal companions holds an important key to the well-being of all of us. Deep awareness and a compassionate process will enable us to find sustainable, ethical solutions. See you for the next episode and look forward to working with you too.